At 93, most people spend their days drafting wills or reminiscing about the past. My grandfather, however, was gearing up for a battle. Meredith Vaughn stormed in with a bulldozer, eviction notices, and 3 rookie cops yelling about how this collapsing shack is ruining the neighborhood. But the instant those steel tracks rolled onto our gravel driveway, everything changed. Floodlights erupted as if a stage show had begun. Razor wire sprang up from hidden trenches, and the quiet Texas ranch I'd always known morphed into something that could have made a Marine drill instructor choke with pride. In less than 15 minutes, the property had become a fortified war zone. Calls went out first to the local police chief, then to the FBI. At first, they assumed Grandpa Walter was just a senile old man making trouble. That was until they realized half of their own forces had once trained under him. This wasn't petty revenge, it was a counter-operation, one that the HOA would never forget. It had taken minutes to spring the trap, but the fallout would linger for an entire year. My pulse nearly gave out when I saw the truth of who my grandfather really was, the way he scanned every corner before stepping outside, how his eyes swept across the horizon like radar, and the casual motion of his hand drifting toward his hip as if a radio belonged there. None of this matched the life of a man who'd supposedly spent decades raising chickens and mending fences. These were reflexes honed in a much harsher world. That morning had begun like any other. I'd driven down from Austin to help with some yard work, which usually meant I hauled logs while he sat in his rocking chair with a mug of coffee strong enough to peel paint. The October air carried the crisp tang of oak leaves and that faint scent Texas always wears before the weather changes. But Grandpa had been quieter than usual lately. I thought it was just the HOA harassment letters that had him on edge. I couldn't have been more wrong. The first clue came around mid-morning. While I was dragging branches across the yard, I caught the sound of multiple engines, a deep, heavy ONES rumbling up our half-mile driveway. This wasn't the UPS guy, or a tourist who'd taken a wrong turn. No, these were machines built for force. Between the trees, I glimpsed flashes of yellow and chromia construction equipment. My gut twisted. You don't drive a bulldozer up to someone's home unless you're planning destruction. Grandpa stepped out of the house like a man half his age. Gone was the slow shuffle I'd grown used to. Instead, he moved with precision, setting himself on the porch with clear lines of sight to the incoming vehicles. His back rested against the wall, his hand hovering near something I couldn't see. When he spoke, his voice was calm, but carried a weight I'd never heard before. "Jake, get inside. No questions, no hesitation. Go." The convoy rolled into our yard like it belonged on a movie set. Leading was a massive yellow bulldozer, followed by a spotless white Escalade and 2 gleaming police cruisers. From the SUV stepped Meredith Vaughn herself, draped in an immaculate white blazer that likely cost more than my rent. Her blonde hair was shellacked against the wind, and she strode across the property as though she already owned it. Behind her trailed 3 jittery young officers who looked fresh out of training. The bulldozer driver climbed down reluctantly, clearly uneasy with the job he'd been given. Waving a stack of documents, Meredith launched into her speech about safety hazards and demolition orders, her tone the polished arrogance of someone who's never been told number. That's when Grandpa stunned me. He didn't yell, argue, or demand a lawyer. Instead, he pulled an old military radio from his shirt pocket, a real tactical equipment, not some toy. He pressed a button, spoke in numbers I didn't recognize, and waited. A crisp, professional voice answered back. Then the property came alive. Hidden floodlights flared, bathing every angle of the yard. What I'd thought were fence posts suddenly uncoiled razor wire in perfect formation. The land I'd known all my life revealed itself for what it truly was, a disguised fortress. The rookie officers froze, hands twitching toward their weapons. The bulldozer operator panicked, slamming his machine into reverse, the treads kicking up gravel. For the first time, Meredith's mask cracked, her confidence faltered, her face betraying fear, genuine fear of a 93-year-old man who had just exposed himself as something far more dangerous. From the house, I watched as my grandfather's radio buzzed with coded replies. These weren't local channels or county frequencies, this was federal. They knew who Walter Briggs was, and they were very, very interested in why Meredith Vaughn and her makeshift squad had marched onto his property under shaky legal authority. The standoff dragged on for minutes that felt like eternity. Meredith screamed into her phone about compound emergencies. Her officers realized they'd stumbled into something way beyond their pay grade. Meanwhile, my grandfather calmly coordinated with people who addressed him as sir and treated his land like an active federal crime scene. And in that moment, my entire world shifted. Grandpa wasn't just a farmer sitting on land someone wanted to buy. He was something much more. A man who'd built his life via and his home in not as a rancher, but as a soldier prepared for a war no one else saw coming. The level of preparation, the advanced comms gear, and the swift reaction from federal channels all pointed to one chilling truth. Walter Briggs hadn't lived a simple life. He had been someone powerful, someone who'd operated in a world where mistakes weren't forgiven. And on this day, his quiet retirement was shattered. I could barely breathe as the realization sank in. My grandfather was no ordinary farmer. His habit of scanning every shadow before stepping outside wasn't country caution, it was battlefield instinct. Then came the sound that froze my veins solid. From beneath the floor, a low mechanical hum rose in, not the noise of settling foundations or rodents in the walls. This was the unmistakable thrum of military-grade systems powering up. And it was happening right under my boots. When Meredith's entourage finally fled in disarray, Grandpa strolled back inside like he'd only just finished watering the garden. No explanation, no acknowledgement of the chaos, just the same steady gait I'd seen my whole life. But now, every detail carried new meaning. He never sat with his back to a doorway. He always seemed to know a car was coming long before the sound carried, and somehow, our backwoods farmhouse had cell reception better than anything I could get in downtown Austin. I found him in the kitchen, calmly brewing a fresh pot of coffee, hand steady as if federal agents weren't likely barreling down the highway toward us that very second. Yet I noticed what I'd never seen before: small scars across his knuckles, too sharp to be from farm chores. The way he angled himself, keeping both entrances in sight, and beneath his arm, the subtle outline of something that definitely wasn't a wallet. "Grandpa," I blurted, my voice rough with panic. "What the hell just happened out there?" He studied me in silence, those ice blue eyes weighing something only he understood. Then he poured 2 cups, slid one across the table, and finally spoke words that rewrote everything I thought I knew about our family. "Son, there are truths about your grandfather your parents never thought you needed to hear." He lowered himself into the chair with the deliberate ease of someone who'd spent decades giving briefings. "But after what happened today, I suppose keeping those secrets isn't an option anymore." The coffee was darker, sharper than usual, a taste that fit the gravity of the moment. And then the dam broke. He began to tell me his story. 24 years with the FBI's Tactical Response Division, specialist in what he called high-risk urban engagements, hostage crises, armed compounds, domestic terrorism. Operations so dangerous they never made the evening news because they ended before anyone outside the bureau even knew they had begun. He wasn't just part of the team they called him when SWAT was in over its head. He wrote training manuals still being used in 3 states. Walter Briggs wasn't a retiree with chickens and fences. He was a name whispered in circles that ordinary people never knew existed. The ranch was meant to be just that, a quiet place to grow old, he admitted, staring through the window toward the oak line that had shielded us earlier that morning. But when you've spent 40 years teaching men to think like the enemy, you never stop seeing the world that way. Suddenly, everything about the property made sense. The floodlights, the razor wire, the careful layout of buildings and terrain. This wasn't just a home, it was a stronghold designed by someone who'd spent his life learning how to break into places just like it. Then came the basement revelation. What I'd always thought was a root cellar turned out to be an entrance. Behind shelves of dusty mason jars, a steel door opened to a staircase descending deep underground. The tunnels were no makeshift shelter, they were professional. Reinforced walls, generator systems, communication hubs, and surveillance equipment covering every possible approach to the ranch. Maps lined the walls, each marked with side lanes, fallback routes, and defensive positions extending well into the state forest. These tunnels were already here when I bought the land, Grandpa explained. running his hand across the concrete. Built during World War II, when folks thought German subs might make it inland. I'd just a broken bar updated the technology. Updated was an understatement. Fiber optic cabling, satellite uplinks, and monitoring systems sophisticated enough to rival a military command post. Every door, every window, every tree linea covered by cameras so seamlessly hidden that in all my years of visiting, I'd never noticed a single one. The realization hit me hardest when I thought about my childhood summers here, the times I played soldier in the fields, running through the woods with plastic rifles. Every silly game of hide-and-seek had been watched by a man who could have written textbooks on concealment and counter-surveillance. All those carefree memories suddenly felt less like play and more like training missions I hadn't known I was part of. And then the family dynamic began to click into place in ways that hurt. Why my father had always been reluctant to bring us here. Why conversations died the moment I walked into the room at family gatherings. Why Grandpa had asked such oddly specific questions about my brief stint in the police academy, questions that no retired farmer would have cared about. He hadn't just been interested, he had been measuring me. My parents hadn't been shielding me from a scandal or a troublesome relative, they'd been keeping me at a safe distance from a man whose very presence could put lives in jeopardy. Your father was worried, Grandpa said quietly, as though plucking the thought straight out of my head. He figured if you knew the kind of work I did, you'd be tempted to follow the same trail, and he'd seen enough of the price it cost me to want something better for his boy. That cost became clearer when he opened a drawer in his desk and pulled out a bundle of old photographs. There was a younger Walter Briggs in tactical gear, standing among teams of agents whose faces had been deliberately blacked out, commendations and certificates lay tucked in beside them, dates and locations redacted, the letterhead stripped off for security. But it was the last picture that tied everything together, a snapshot of Grandpa beside a woman in FBI fatigues, both of them grinning in front of what looked like a training facility. The woman's face stopped me cold. She was younger in the photo, but the sharp eyes and calculating stare were unmistakable. Hours earlier, I'd seen that same expression on the woman climbing out of a white Escalade with forged legal documents and a bulldozer. Sarah Morrison. She hadn't just been Meredith Vaughn's legal muscle, she'd once been my grandfather's partner, his Prot A tilde copyright GA tilde copyright, and apparently still someone who answered when he called. The low rumble from beneath us grew louder, the sequence of machines powering up like an orchestra of hidden steel. This wasn't some dusty relic of Grandpa's past. His underground facility was alive, wired into networks that could still mobilize federal resources with the press of a button. Meredith had waged war against a man who had trained the very people now closing in on her. The call that shifted everything came that afternoon. At exactly 2:47, Meredith rang. I knew it was bad news before she even finished her first sentence. Her voice carried that brittle, falsely sweet tone lawyers use when they're delivering a threat in polite wrapping paper. Grandpa and I had been in the yard, of all things, interrogating the chickens. It sounded absurd, but he claimed that if you studied them closely, you could tell whether they'd been disturbed during the night. An improvised early warning system most people would laugh at, but he treated like gospel. Then Meredith's voice came through the speaker, each word polished like glass. Mr. Briggs, I'm calling to inform you that the Meadowbrook Homeowners Association has filed an emergency injunction regarding the public safety hazard your property represents to the community. She paused for emphasis, probably consulting her notes to hit every intimidation beat. We had documentation of unauthorized defensive structures, potential weapons stockpiling, and what appears to be an unlicensed communication hub operating on residential land. What struck me wasn't just the arrogance of her accusations, but how carefully they had been crafted. These weren't random HOA complaints. Someone had done real research, pinpointing the exact vulnerabilities that might corner a former federal operative. This wasn't harassment, it was lawfare, carried out with professional precision. Grandpa didn't try to the bait. His response was calm, surgical. No denials, no threats, no visible anger, just one question that sliced straight through her argument. Mrs. Vaughn, how did you acquire detailed information about systems that can't be seen from any public access point? The silence that followed stretched too long, The kind of pause where someone realizes they've overplayed their hand. "We have rights as concerned community members to investigate potential hazards," she finally replied, though her earlier confidence had cracked. "And we're backed by Pinnacle Development Corporation, which has a vested interest in maintaining property values in this region." There it was, the truth finally showing its teeth. Pinnacle wasn't some mom-and-pop contractor. They were a corporate giant, the kind of conglomerate that could bulldoze entire Texas towns with a single project bid. Then Meredith's tone hardened. She began reciting a checklist of required compliance measures: dismantling all defensive systems, surrendering communications hardware for inspection, and submitting to routine property searches. Each demand rolled off her tongue with the bureaucratic precision of someone who had done this before, likely against others who stood in the way of lucrative developments. But it was her closing statement that sent a chill down my spine. "Mr. Briggs, you have 72 hours to comply. If not, we'll escalate this to the proper authorities." "I'm sure a man with your background understands the importance of cooperating with legitimate law enforcement." The threat was unmistakable. Meredith had allies in law enforcement willing to play her game, and she was warning us that they would soon be knocking even for someone with federal credentials. Meredith's threats would have been hard to ignore. After she hung up, Grandpa sat in silence, his eyes fixed on the phone like it might detonate. When he finally spoke, his voice was low but carried a dangerous edge I had never heard before. "Jake," he said evenly, "that woman just made the biggest mistake of her career." He rose from his chair with movements that belied his 93 years, striding to the window that commanded a view of every road leading on to the ranch. "She's not up against a stubborn old farmer anymore. She's declared war on the man who wrote the handbook for this kind of fight." The change in him was unnerving. Only an hour earlier, he'd been showing me how to read chickens like a security system. Now, he looked every bit the tactician who had spent decades preparing for exactly this moment. He moved through the house with purposeful efficiency, checking systems I hadn't even realized existed, making small adjustments to devices that had been hiding in plain sight all my life. This wasn't preparation, it was activation. The truth became undeniable when he opened a thick folder from his desk. Inside was not the casual research of a curious retiree, but a professional intelligence report on Meredith Vaughn and Pinnacle Development. Financial records, legal briefs, even surveillance photos taken from hidden vantage points around town. My grandfather hadn't just been fending off whole letters, he had been running a counterintelligence operation. "She thinks she's playing chess," he said, spreading documents across the kitchen table. "What she doesn't realize is that I helped write the rules." The pattern emerged quickly once I knew how to read it. Pinnacle had a method: target rural properties owned by the elderly, lean on them with HOA regulations and legal harassment, then force the sale for pennies on the dollar before flipping the land for massive profit. The most chilling detail wasn't the acquisitions themselves but the aftermath. In the file, 12 families had been pressured into giving up their land over the past 3 years. Elderly, isolated, all driven out by the same tactics Meredith was now using on us. And 3 of those families' elders hadn't survived more than 6 months after being relocated to deaths officially attributed to natural causes linked to stress and age. When Meredith called back later that evening, her tone had shifted. Gone was the stiff legal posturing. Now, her voice carried a syrupy politeness edged with something darker, almost eager. "Mr. Briggs, I trust you've had time to consider our very reasonable requests. We're simply looking out for the community's safety and standards." But beneath her words was a spark of anticipation, as if she couldn't wait for what came next. Grandpa answered with a composure that reminded me of someone giving firing coordinates to an artillery crew. "Mrs. Vaughn, I've thought carefully about your requests," he said, "and I've decided tomorrow morning would be the perfect time for you to come here and prove exactly what kind of authority you believe you have over my property. I'll be waiting." The pause that followed was thick as storm air. Meredith laughed before hanging up, a sharp, cutting laugh that told me she thought victory was already hers. By dawn, fog rolled across the Texas hills in thick blankets. I realized later that Grandpa had been counting on that cover all along. By 5 a.m., he was already moving through the dim light with an energy that made me finally understand why the FBI had held on to him for nearly 30 years. This wasn't an old man bracing for trouble. This was a strategist executing a plan he'd been refining since the day he bought the land. I found him in the underground command room, the glow of monitors illuminating his face. Dozens of camera feeds flickered across the screens, covering every possible approach from the main gravel road to narrow deer paths threading through the forest. The system wasn't just thorough, it was military-grade, complete with infrared imaging and motion tracking so precise it could follow a squirrel darting between branches. "How long has all this been here?" I asked, staring at the wall of technology. 25 years, give or take," he replied without glancing away from the screens. "Took me 3 years after retirement to get everything integrated properly. Figured if I was going to vanish into the countryside, I'd better make sure I could see trouble coming from any direction." The way he said it so casually sent a shiver down my spine. His so-called retirement had never been about rest, it was a strategic redeployment. At 6:47 a.m., the first blips appeared on the monitors. Vehicles is still more than a mile away, but moving in formation with a precision that screamed serious intent. 3 police cruisers, advancing like the opening move in a military drill. The same white Escalade from the day before appeared in the lead, followed closely by what looked like a county sheriff's vehicle. But it wasn't until I saw the bulldozer that I understood this wasn't just another legal intimidation attempt. They weren't here to argue, they were here to destroy. And they'd brought more than enough muscle to deal with what they thought was just a frail old man. Grandpa's reaction was unlike anything I'd ever seen. Instead of fear or even worry, he slipped into a state of razor-sharp focus that sent a chill through me. His movements were efficient, deliberate, as if every action served 2 or 3 purposes at once. He powered up communication systems, adjusted camera angles, and began what he calmly referred to as defensive protocols, his fingers moving across the controls with the precision of a man following a battle-tested checklist. "Jake," he said without looking away from the monitors, "what's about to happen isn't random. And it's not just about our land. Vaughn and her corporate backers have done this before, probably more times than we know. They succeed because their victims never respond with professional tactics." He adjusted what looked like a frequency scanner and added quietly, "Today, that pattern ends." From that moment, the property I thought I knew began to change before my eyes. Hidden systems activated in sequence, transforming the quiet ranch into something resembling a fortress. Floodlights that didn't illuminate so much as disorient snapped on, positioned to blind rather than guide. Barriers unfolded from hidden compartments in the ground, funneling any incoming vehicles into narrow choke points. Communication relays locked into position, capable of pinging federal agencies faster than a local sheriff's office could dispatch a cruiser. And while the equipment was impressive, it was the preparation of the mind that struck me most. Grandpa had studied Meredith Vaughn in depth, her methods, her tendencies, her arrogance. He knew she would come with overwhelming force, because that had always worked for her. He knew she would try to intimidate with authority and legal jargon. And most importantly, he knew she would underestimate him, seeing only a stubborn old farmer instead of a strategist who had been preparing for this day since long before she was born. At exactly 7:12 a.m., the convoy reached our front gate precisely when Grandpa had predicted they would. This wasn't chance or guesswork, this was intelligence work so exact that it would have impressed a military command center. He had mapped their route, calculated their speed, and probably even knew what diner they'd stopped at for breakfast. Vaughn was the first to step out of her Escalade, dressed in gear straight out of a glossy outdoor catalog, complete with a high-end radio headset. She looked like she was about to lead a tactical raid, not a property dispute. Behind her came 5 men, not the rookies from the day before, but hard-eyed professionals, private security or off-duty law enforcement, armored and armed like they were prepared for war. The bulldozer operator, though, seemed uneasy, as if he realized he was in over his head. Heavy machinery doesn't behave the same on unfamiliar ground, and he looked like he knew it. Vaughn didn't share his hesitation. She barked into her headset, ordering her people around as if she were running a military operation. That's when Grandpa showed exactly why the FBI had trusted him with their most impossible assignments. Instead of meeting them head-on, He initiated what he called area denial protocols. Our ranch instantly became a battlefield no intruder would want to cross. Floodlights triggered in overlapping beams, creating walls of blinding white glare in the fog. Barriers surged from the earth, redirecting the bulldozer into a path designed to trap it. And, most importantly, Grandpa's communication system began broadcasting on every frequency law enforcement in the state monitored. His message was calm but devastatingly precise. He reported the convoy's composition, their military-style organization, and described the assault as domestic terrorism targeting elderly landowners. He even requested immediate federal investigation. The bulldozer never made it far. It crawled just 47 feet onto our property before its operator realized too late that the ground wasn't solid at all. Grandpa had prepared soft zone as a muddy traps disguised as stable terrain. The tread spun helplessly, sinking deeper with every attempt to back out. Meanwhile, the other vehicles were swallowed in an impenetrable glare. The morning fog turned the floodlights into walls of pure white, leaving Vaughn's hired men half-blind and disoriented. But it was the radio traffic that truly turned the tables. Within minutes, 3 different agencies were demanding answers from a convoy that had expected to carry out their mission without anyone watching. In 12 minutes flat, my grandfather had transformed our quiet Texas ranch into something that could have tested a Marine assault unit. Watching our quiet ranch shift into what looked like an active crime scene was like seeing a chess master spring a trap they'd been setting for dozens of moves. Nothing my grandfather did was random. Every system served more than one purpose. Every transmission carried both tactical weight in the moment and strategic value for later. And above all, everything was being recorded by hidden surveillance rigs that would provide undeniable proof of exactly what went down. Standing in the underground command post, I saw veteran lawmen realize they'd been completely outclassed by someone they'd brushed off as a harmless old man. Meredith Vaughn had rolled in with numbers, machines, and swagger, but she'd stumbled straight into a battleground designed by a man who had spent a quarter-century preparing for just this kind of showdown. The radio erupted with traffic from agencies using call signs I didn't recognize, and I knew our quiet morning had just become the center of a storm. In only 12 minutes, Grandpa had turned the ranch into a fortress so secure that even a SWAT team would hesitate before making a move. And then it hit me. What happens when you think you're hunting an old farmer, but you've actually walked into the snare of the very man who used to teach federal agents how to hunt people like you? At 8:23 a.m., the distant thump of rotor blades broke the morning air. The first FBI helicopter appeared, and I saw Meredith's face shift from smug command to pale realization. She had walked straight into something way bigger than her pay grade. But it was the voice on Grandpa's radio that froze me in place. Agent Sarah Morrison. She wasn't just an old colleague. She was his Prot A tilde copyright GA tilde copyright his former partner, and she'd apparently been waiting 25 years for Walter Briggs to call for backup. Control. This is Falcon 7, requesting immediate ground assessment of the tactical situation at your coordinates. Her voice crackled through, steady and commanding. We have visual on unauthorized law enforcement activity, heavy equipment in play, and what looks like a coordinated assault against a federal asset. That phrasey federal asset hit me hard. That's what my grandfather had been all along, even in so-called retirement. Grandpa's reply showed exactly why his reputation had become legend. Calm as a Sunday chat, he answered, Falcon 7, this is home base. Establish a perimeter at safe distance and hold observation. Hostiles appear to be using forged authority and may have compromised local law enforcement. His tone was so casual it sounded like he was making weekend fishing plans, not exposing a criminal conspiracy in real time. The effect on Meredith's men was immediate. The hired professionals who had swaggered and now looked like they wanted nothing more than to vanish. Experienced security contractors know the difference between bullying landowners and getting tangled in a federal investigation. One carries fines, the other carries prison time that can last decades. Their stance shifted from aggressive to hesitant retreat as the reality sank in. And Meredith, she showed her true colors. Instead of helping the bulldozer operator who was still stuck in the mud pit Grandpa had engineered or taking any responsibility, She bolted. She abandoned her crew and sprinted for her escalade like a cornered thief. That's when Morrison's voice came back over the radio, dry with humor. Home base. We have one subject attempting to flee, leaving what looks like compromised law enforcement in vulnerable positions. Should we mark this as an admission of guilt or just bad tactical planning? It was rhetorical, of course, but it underlined the gap between professionals and opportunists. The federal presence grew fast. Within half an hour, FBI agents, ATF investigators, and even Treasury officials were setting up a secure perimeter around the ranch. And the difference was clear. They weren't here to question us. They were here to treat Meredith's convoy as suspects in a multi-jurisdiction crime. Worse for Meredith, the intercepted communications sealed her fate. She thought her backroom deals with Chief Reynolds had been discreet. She was wrong. Federal ears were sharper than she'd ever guessed. Her conversations about eliminating the Briggs problem weren't just overheard, they were recorded. Meredith's downfall became undeniable once investigators uncovered her direct coordination with county officials to rush through the demolition process. It painted a damning picture. A calculated conspiracy to trample civil rights under the false appearance of legal authority. But the nail in her coffin was the so-called emergency demolition order she had been brandishing with such confidence. The document was a forgery, and federal agents don't look kindly on forged government paperwork, especially when it's being used to justify what it amounted to: an armed assault on private property. Charges like impersonating federal authority and conspiring to violate civil rights carry sentences that can stretch into decades, sometimes even life, when prosecutors decide to set an example. The most satisfying moment came when Agent Sarah Morrison finally addressed Meredith directly over the radio. "Mrs. Vaughn, this is Special Agent Morrison with the FBI. You and your associates are under federal investigation for conspiracy, fraud, and civil rights violations under color of law. With your legal background, I trust you understand the weight of those charges." The silence that followed was heavy, long enough for Meredith to process the reality of her situation. Morrison's voice returned, sharp and firm. "We'll need you to step away from your vehicle and assume a position suitable for someone about to have a very bad day." From that point on, it was clear this wasn't luck or coincidence. The seamless coordination between Walter and Morrison revealed a partnership that had never truly ended. They anticipated each other's moves, spoke in shorthand, and executed containment maneuvers with surgical precision, all without a single shot fired. Then Morrison dropped the revelation that shattered Meredith's last shred of authority. She began reading aloud from what was obviously a detailed case file. "We've been monitoring Pinnacle Development Corporation's acquisitions for 18 months. 12 elderly property owners forced into selling under suspicious pressure. 3 subsequent deaths linked to relocation stress. Financial evidence of systematic fraud and elder exploitation." Each allegation landed like a hammer strike. It became obvious that this morning's clash wasn't the beginning, it was the climax of a far-reaching federal investigation. The hired contractors, once so confident, suddenly realized they were standing in the middle of a federal crime scene. Their decision to surrender without resistance said everything. They knew the difference between a bad job and a criminal conspiracy. Most of them quickly offered cooperation, ready to testify about who hired them, what they were paid, and the orders they'd been given. The bulldozer operator's story was the most tragic. He thought he'd been contracted for legitimate work. Only now did he understand that he had been used as part of what federal agents were calling domestic terrorism aimed at intimidating elderly homeowners. He wasted no time cooperating fully, giving investigators his work orders, his timeline, and even admitting the doubts he'd had about the project's legality. The moment that stuck with me came from Morrison's final radio exchange with my grandfather. "Walter, I have to ask," she said, her tone carrying respect that went beyond duty. "How long have you been preparing for this?" His reply was calm, almost proud. "Sarah, I've been ready since the day I bought this land." Then it came, the metallic snap of handcuffs locking around Meredith Vaughn's wrists, followed by Morrison's steady voice delivering Miranda rights. The woman who had strutted in waving fraudulent authority was now facing federal detention and lawyers who specialized in civil rights violations. Morrison couldn't resist one last dry laugh over the radio, a laugh that drained the color from Meredith's face. She finally realized she had been defeated not just by Walter Briggs, but by the very agent he had once trained to outthink people exactly like her. By 9:15 a.m., the spectacle had become a public event. Mrs. Henderson was the first to whip out her phone, streaming live as federal agents arrested what looked like a private militia caught trying to bulldoze the home of a 93-year-old veteran. Within minutes, half the county was broadcasting the takedown, turning Meredith's intimidation campaign into viral fuel for public outrage. From the front porch, I watched neighbors emerge from the morning mist, phones raised, capturing every second of what was quickly becoming the most memorable law enforcement operation the Texas Hill Country had ever seen. Mrs. Patterson, who lived 3 miles down the road, was narrating the whole thing to her Facebook Live audience, gushing that sweet old Walter was finally getting the respect he deserved. Walter was finally getting the recognition he deserved. The Johnson family showed up with their teenagers, who were already cutting TikTok clips captioned with lines like "Grandpa shuts down Karen with facts and FBI support." The shift in public opinion was immediate, faster than anything I'd ever seen. Within hours, #Justice for Walter was trending nationwide, with thousands sharing clips of Meredith's arrest alongside personal stories of HOA intimidation and corporate bullying. Clear audio of Meredith's frantic phone calls to Pinnacle Development surfaced online. Her desperate attempts to spin the disaster as a miscommunication were quickly remixed into viral comedy by creators known for mocking entitled behavior. But the real turning point came from the local response. People who had kept quiet for months, silenced by Meredith's threats and corporate backing, suddenly spoke up once they realized she was facing federal charges. The small coffee shop downtown transformed into an impromptu headquarters, buzzing with neighbors trading stories about HOA harassment, shady land disputes, and high-pressure offers to sell family property. The footage that did the most damage came from 16-year-old Tommy Martinez, who launched his drone that morning. From the air, he captured everything: the professional precision of Meredith's hired team, the tactical skill behind Walter's defenses, and the most damning of all, the exact moment Meredith abandoned her own security crew to protect herself. That visual proof of her cowardice, combined with her recorded threats, created an image no corporate PR team could ever repair. At 11 a.m., Agent Morrison held a press briefing that transformed what could have been a small-town headline into a national scandal. Standing firmly in front of Walter's property, she declared with the authority of someone who had spent 25 years dismantling criminal empires, "What you've witnessed today is the conclusion of an 18-month federal investigation into widespread fraud, elder abuse, and civil rights violations under color of law." Her words made everything 10 times worse for Meredith. Pinnacle Development wasn't just buying land, it was systematically targeting elderly veterans and widows, using harassment, isolation, and fraudulent orders to force sales at bargain prices. The scheme was so consistent across multiple states that federal agents had officially labeled it an organized criminal enterprise. What really set the internet on fire, though, was Morrison's casual revelation that Walter Briggs himself had been instrumental in developing many of the investigative methods the FBI used to expose criminal organizations. For 24 years, he had trained agents on how to dismantle predators who preyed on the vulnerable. And now, those very techniques were protecting him from the same kind of predators he had fought against his entire career. The backlash online was immediate and merciless. Within hours, internet sleuths uncovered Meredith's work history and her ties to previous property acquisitions linked to suspicious deaths. Her LinkedIn page was flooded with furious comments from people who had lived through similar scams. Her polished corporate headshot quickly became a meme symbolizing what happens when arrogance collides with justice. One of the most viral clips came from a neighbor's security camera. It showed Meredith's confident arrival that morning, but someone had edited the footage with dramatic music and slow-motion effects. The result was a brutal side-by-side of corporate arrogance striding onto Walter's land juxtaposed with her being handcuffed and read her rights. The contrast was comedy gold for millions of viewers who had their own horror stories. By lunchtime, local news had spread the story statewide. but national coverage pushed it into every household. Cable news anchors used it as a springboard for discussions on corporate abuse of elderly homeowners, the militarization of civil disputes, and the need for stronger protections for veterans. Every broadcast replayed clips of Walter calmly coordinating with federal agents while Meredith's so-called security realized they'd been outmaneuvered by a man old enough to be their grandfather. The fallout for Pinnacle Development was immediate. Their stock plummeted 12% in a single trading day. Business partners scrambled to sever ties. Class-action law firms began contacting families who had been pressured into suspicious property sales. For Meredith, though, the personal consequences were even harsher. Her career was obliterated overnight. Her name became shorthand for corporate bullying, and her face was plastered across social media as a warning of what happens when greed goes unchecked. Instead of overseeing a demolition, she was now staring down decades in prison while millions of Americans demanded the harshest sentence possible. And then came the most satisfying turn of all. Families of the 3 elderly homeowners who had died after being pressured to sell were finally given a voice. Their stories became part of the national outrage, cementing Meredith Vaughn's legacy not as a powerful executive, but as the villain in one of the most public corporate scandals in recent memory. The families of elderly homeowners who had died after being forced to sell their land to Pinnacle soon came forward. Their relatives spoke to reporters about shady tactics, unexplained circumstances, and the heartbreak of losing homes that had been in their families for generations. Each testimony strengthened the federal case and added fuel to the public outrage. By evening, videos related to Meredith's downfall had amassed over 2 million views. Comment sections were overflowing with veterans sharing their own experiences of standing up against bullies, corrupt boards, and corporate intimidation. The story Meredith had hoped would showcase law and order had flipped completely. It had become a viral celebration of an American veteran who refused to bow to people who picked the wrong fight. Clips of Meredith in handcuffs, flanked by federal agents while her high-powered attorneys scrambled in the background, spread like wildfire. 2 million views in just 6 hours. Yet, that was only the beginning. What followed was a year-long unraveling of everything she had built through decades of predatory business practices. 3 months after Meredith Vaughn's arrest, our ranch had turned into something I never imagined, a pilgrimage site for people who had been strong-armed by HOA boards, greedy developers, and officials who'd forgotten that ordinary Americans don't back down easily. What started as a single property dispute grew into a grassroots movement, with Grandpa Walter reluctantly stepping into the role of a symbol of resistance against corporate bullying and institutional intimidation. The transformation of our quiet family land into an informal training ground happened gradually, then suddenly all at once. First, neighbors asked Walter to look over their paperwork from developers. Then veterans from nearby counties showed up for advice on how to defend their property rights. Soon, retired teachers, aging farmers, and small business owners began arriving on weekends to attend what Walter jokingly called defensive planning for people who just want to be left alone. The irony wasn't lost on me. Walter had tried to fade quietly into retirement, but now he was more influential than he'd ever been in his federal career. Local papers nicknamed him the defender of Texas Hill Country. National outlets portrayed him as proof that American grit wasn't gone yet, it had just been sleeping in those who'd been told they were too old to matter. Each week, more neighbors succeeded in pushing back against bullies who once seemed untouchable. Meanwhile, the legal consequences piled up. Federal prosecutors used Meredith's case as the blueprint for cracking open similar scams across multiple states. They uncovered a web of corporate predators that had been targeting elderly Americans for years. Evidence from our confrontation became the backbone of what experts began calling the largest elder abuse prosecution in U.S. history. Meredith's personal downfall went far beyond viral internet shame. Her law license was suspended while criminal charges loomed. Federal courts froze her assets under forfeiture laws designed to strip criminals of their profits. And perhaps most crushing of all, her victims and the families of victims filed civil suits that would ensure she spent the rest of her life paying restitution. Pinnacle Development itself collapsed under the weight of investigation. Authorities traced its operations across 7 states, documenting more than 60 elderly property owners who had been coerced into unfair sales through threats and fraud. The flood of class action lawsuits promised to bankrupt the company, while indictments of its leadership all but guaranteed prison sentences. But the biggest change wasn't in courtrooms or stock markets, it was right here in our town. People who once felt isolated and powerless now became part of a growing network that traded information about shady development plans, suspicious legal threats, and officials too cozy with corporate money. The downtown coffee shop became the unofficial headquarters of what folks started calling the Briggs Network, though Walter insisted he was just giving advice to neighbors. For Walter, teaching came naturally. After all, he had spent decades training federal agents to think strategically. Now, his weekend sessions covered everything from understanding property laws, spotting fraudulent documents, and setting up surveillance systems that could catch harassment without breaking privacy rules. His students were a mix of retired soldiers, school teachers, and farmers determined to protect their family's land. What struck me most was seeing my grandfather rediscover his sense of purpose. These weren't terrorists or criminals he was standing against anymore, just ordinary people who needed someone with his knowledge to help them defend what they had worked their whole lives to build. And the pride he felt in empowering them to stand tall was worth more to him than any medal or commendation he'd earned in his career. What mattered more to Walter than any medal or federal award was seeing real lives repaired. The investigations kept peeling back layers of rot that spread far beyond our first clash with Meredith. Police Chief Reynolds was indicted for taking bribes to give corporate harassment the appearance of lawful authority. County officials who had rubber-stamped shady demolition permits were discovering that civil rights violations don't get brushed aside when federal prosecutors are involved. Piece by piece, the entire corrupt structure that had protected Meredith's schemes was being dismantled. Agent Morrison became a familiar face at the ranch, not just as a federal officer, but as someone who genuinely valued working with Walter again. Their bond shifted into a sort of informal consulting role. Federal teams frequently sought Walter's perspective on identifying and shutting down elder exploitation scams before they destroyed more families. For the victims, the recovery went far beyond expectations. Through asset forfeiture, investigators seized millions in illicit profits from Pinnacle's predatory campaigns. Families who thought they'd lost everything were compensated, and in many cases, land stolen under fraudulent legal tricks was returned to its rightful owners. 6 months after that day, Walter and I were sitting on the porch, watching another group of neighbors head home from one of his weekend workshops. He turned to me with a look I'd never seen before. It wasn't victory or relief, it was peace. The peace of a man who had finally found the best way to use the years he had left. "Jake," he said, watching the taillights vanish down our drive, "I've been thinking about something your grandmother used to tell me. She always said the best teachers are the ones who show people they're stronger than they think." I spent 24 years teaching agents how to hunt criminals. Maybe now it's time I teach ordinary folks how to protect themselves from predators who mistake age for weakness. The invitation was clear in his voice, and for the first time since leaving the police academy, I felt I knew what I was meant to do. "You're asking if I want to learn the family trade?" I said. He smiled, but still gave me the words, "Son, I'm asking if you want to help make sure people like Meredith Vaughn think twice before starting fights they can't win." Now, as I write this from Chicago while covering the federal prosecution of the Pinnacle conspiracy, I can tell you Meredith's 12-month nightmare has become a cautionary tale. It's changed how corporate predators approach elderly property owners nationwide. More than that, it's living proof that some Americans will never be too old, too small, or too outnumbered to stand their ground when justice demands it. Walter looked at me that evening with eyes full of decades spent shielding those who couldn't defend themselves. "Do you want to learn the trade?" he asked. "Because Meredith hasn't given up yet, and the world needs more people like us. So I'll ask you, has someone with power ever tried to intimidate you into surrendering what's rightfully yours? Maybe it's a pushy hoe, a dishonest landlord, or corporate bullies betting on your silence." Walter's story shows that preparation, knowledge, and refusing to back down can flip the script on predators who assume you're an easy mark. If you believe wisdom and experience deserve respect and not dismissal, then you already understand the heart of this fight. And if you want more stories of everyday heroes who refuse to be victims, subscribe to Anadrama Nesto, because sometimes the best defense is knowing you're not standing alone. Thank you for staying with us through this story. We'll see you in the next battle.